Hey, MCE crew, the whole opportunity in green investing, it's not going to end like many people think it will. We're going to go over exactly what this thing is going to look like and what are the most viable options for investing in clean energy. Now, we're going to need to obviously power this nation, this world, to a greater extent with each passing year because we become more of a technologically based society. And although some out there believe that we get our energy from, I don't know, the horns of unicorns or some other magical place, in reality, there are sources of energy that we need to either capture from renewable sources like solar or wind, or we need to mine, like in the case of natural gas, oil, or uranium, even. So let's talk about what will be the winning strategy for environmental investing as we move forward into the 21st century, toward the mid 21st century. And it might surprise you. So, what we're going to do is we're going to listen to an environmentalist, okay, someone who is ensconced in that whole green energy, Green New Deal type of mindset. And we're going to let him tell us what he believes will be the energy that powers the future. And in some cases, it's powering the now, as we'll see. Without further ado, allow me to introduce you to Michael Schellenberger, who's a green energy expert.
Shortly after I turned 30, I decided I wanted to dedicate a significant amount of my life to solving climate change. I was worried that global warming would end up destroying many of the natural environments that people had worked so hard to protect. I thought the technical solutions were pretty straightforward. Solar panels on every roof, electric car in the driveway, that the main obstacles were political. And so I helped to organize a coalition of the country's biggest labor unions and biggest environmental groups. Our proposal was for a $300 billion investment in renewables. And the idea was not only would we prevent climate change, but we would also create millions of new jobs in a very fast-growing high-tech sector. Our efforts really paid off in 2007, when then presidential candidate Barack Obama embraced our vision. And between 2009 and 2015, the US invested $150 billion in renewables and other kinds of clean tech.
Now, I'll say that Mr. Schellenberger has definitely established his bona fides as a green energy expert, as an energy expert. He knows what he's talking about, and he comes with some facts that may be uncomfortable for many who see this entire energy revolution as more euphoric and sensational or sexy than it needs to be. If we're looking at it from an investment standpoint, we need to be looking at it from the standpoint of data. And boy, does he have a lot of it.
One of the big challenges, of course, is just the intermittency of solar and wind. They only generate electricity about 10 to 30% of the time during most of the year.
So here we see Mr. Schellenberger starting to establish the notion that our pursuit of a green energy future may in some ways actually conflict with a need or a desire to be more in tune with our environment. Okay, so from an environmentalist standpoint, obviously, if you're displacing species, then come on, that can't be good, right? So this is starting to build the case here for why we may need to take a look at some other alternatives when it comes to powering our future.
And in terms of solar, building a solar farm is a lot like building any other kind of farm. You have to clear the whole area of wildlife. So this is a picture of 1/3 of one of the biggest solar farms in California called Ivanpah. In order to build this, they had to clear the whole area of desert tortoises, literally pulling desert tortoises and their babies out of burrows, putting them on the back of pickup trucks and transporting them to captivity, where many of them ended up dying.
So that begs a question, and I'm sure someone somewhere has done some research that would indicate exactly how much of Earth's land would need to be covered with solar panels or wind turbines in order to power a planet of 7 billion people. 7 billion people, more and more of whom are becoming a part of the techno future. So, cell phones, access to the internet, things like that, cryptocurrency mining, all of that involves power. So, as our economy and as our societies evolve, we're definitely going to need more energy, not less. And if we need more energy, these renewable sources, specifically solar and wind, how much more space would need to be dedicated to just that? That's a problem. And one that is in search of a solution that might also have an economic opportunity attached to it. Because now we know that we have a space issue, and we also have to address the original problem, which was to uh, uh, get energy sources that are cleaner and also renewable.
Well, dealing with all of this unreliability and the big environmental impacts obviously comes at a pretty high economic cost. We've been hearing a lot about how solar panels and wind turbines have come down in cost in recent years, but that cost has been significantly outweighed by just the challenges of integrating all of that unreliable power onto the grid. Just take, for instance, what's happened in California. At the period in which solar panels have come down in price very significantly, same with wind, we've seen our electricity prices go up 5 times more than the rest of the country. And it's not unique to us. You can see the same phenomenon happened in Germany, which is really the world's leader in solar, wind, and other renewable technologies. Their prices increased 50% during their big renewable energy push.
Okay, so at a time of rising prices across the board in almost every item, every service that we consume, we're talking about actually being in a situation now where, as we move further and further toward renewables, we're looking at a situation where it's going to cost us more, and I can personally vouch for that. We had our energy supplier connect us to the solar farm that is not far from where I live. We had them do that for a year, and we were getting electricity from that source, and it was more expensive. So what did I do? I went back in, and earlier in the year, I changed that back to the traditional sources, or a mixture of natural gas, coal, and nuclear, because we do have a nuclear power plant here in the area. Solar was much more expensive. Okay. So when you talk about the price pressures that many Americans are feeling right now, if they have a choice, like I did, then what do you think that choice will be? Now, okay, if you're a Hollywood type up in Beverly Hills, or some, hedge fund manager living in Manhattan, then yeah, you can wear your, environmentalism on your sleeve. You can afford to. But I don't know about you, but I'm trying to put as much money into assets as possible, not waste it on a feel good initiative like solar. Not right now, if it's unaffordable.
Now, you might think, well, dealing with climate change is just going to require that we all pay more for energy. That's what I used to think. But consider the case of France. France actually gets twice as much of its electricity from clean, zero-emission sources than does Germany. And yet, France pays half as much, almost half as much for its electricity. How can that be? Well, you might have already anticipated the answer. France gets most of its electricity from nuclear power, about 75% in total. And nuclear just ends up being a lot more reliable, generating power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for about 90% of the year. We see this phenomenon show up at a global level. So, for example, there's been a natural experiment over the last 40 years, even more than that, in terms of the deployment of nuclear and the deployment of solar. You can see that at a little bit higher cost, we got about half as much electricity from solar and wind than we did from nuclear. Well, what does all this mean for going forward? I think one of the most significant findings to date is this one. Had Germany spent $580 billion on nuclear instead of renewables, it would already be getting 100% of its electricity from clean energy sources and all of its transportation energy.
And you guys already know I'm a fan of nuclear power. It's literally harnessing the power of the sun and other stars, harnessing that power to provide energy right here on Earth. A lot of people are, not high on nuclear. It gets a bad name, especially when, history has seen two cities destroyed with nuclear bombs. So that, Chernobyl, uh, it gets a bad rap because a lot of people don't understand it, don't interact with it often enough that they think of. A lot of people are getting their electricity from nuclear sources. Uh, and when that happens, it's like the monster in the horror movie, the one that they never show. That's the scariest one. So once people start to educate themselves, then they start to have a different take on nuclear. Nuclear is turning out to be the alternative that uh, we're going to need moving into the future.
Now, I think you might be wondering, and it's quite reasonable to ask, is nuclear power safe? And what do you do with the waste? Well, those are very reasonable questions. Turns out that there's been scientific studies on this going over 40 years. This is just the most recent study that was done by the prestigious British medical journal Lancet, finds that nuclear power is the safest. It's easy to understand why. According to the World Health Organization, about 7 million people die annually from air pollution, and nuclear plants don't emit that. As a result, the climate scientist James Hansen looked at it, and he calculated that nuclear power has already saved almost 2 million lives to date. It turns out that even wind energy is more deadly than nuclear. This is a photograph taken of two maintenance workers in the Netherlands shortly before one of them fell to his death to avoid the fire, and the other one was engulfed in flames.
When you're talking about land utilization in order to generate power, nuclear obviously is head and shoulders above many of the other options. And while solar is something that, again, is romanticized, it's a very romantic notion that I love. I love the idea of being able to power our electrical needs through and other needs, automotive as well. I love being able to the idea of being able to do that via solar energy because so much of it hits the earth on a daily basis, but it's incoherent and therefore difficult to harness in such a way that we get the type of bang for our buck that we would get out of something like oil or nuclear, coal or natural gas.
What about environmental impact? Well, I think a really easy way to think about it is that uranium fuel, which is what we use to power nuclear plants, is just really energy dense. About the same amount of uranium as this Rubik's Cube can power all of the energy that you need in your entire life. As a consequence, you just don't need that much land in order to produce a significant amount of electricity. Here we can compare the solar farm I just described, Ivanpah, to California's last nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon. It takes 450 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity as it does from nuclear. You would need 17 more solar farms like Ivanpah in order to generate the same output as Diablo Canyon, and of course it would then be unreliable. Well, what about the mining and the waste and the material throughput? Well, this has been studied pretty closely as well, and it just turns out that solar panels require 17 times more materials than nuclear plants do, in the form of cement, glass, concrete, steel, and that includes all the fuel used for those nuclear plants. The consequence is that what comes out at the end, since it's material throughput, is just not a lot of waste from nuclear. All of the waste from the Swiss nuclear program fits into this room. Nuclear waste is actually the only waste from electricity production that's safely contained and internalized. Every other way of making electricity emits the waste into the natural environment, either as pollution or as material waste. We tend to think of solar panels as clean, but the truth is that there is no plan to deal with solar panels at the end of their 20 or 25-year life. A lot of experts are actually very concerned that solar panels are just going to be shipped to poor countries in Africa or Asia with the rest of our electronic waste stream to be disassembled, often exposing people to really high levels of toxic elements, including lead, cadmium, and chromium, elements that, because they're elements, their toxicity never declines over time.
Now, this next question he asked is the $1,000,000 question. This is the one that I believe people are going to start waking up to, especially as you see a lot of these solar panels age out. So, for example, in my neck of the woods, we have a few people they got the solar panels a long time ago, and I noticed they were glossy and they were really attractive. But now we've got that sheen coming off of it. It's got some weatherization going on, and also they've got new technologies where they've got roofing tiles that are solar. So it's kind of making it seem like you have an 8-track tape stuck to your roof if you've got those first generation or second generation panels still up there. Technology moves so fast that you can be guaranteed that unless you get roofing tiles at some point, you're going to be aesthetically behind the curve. And even if you get something like roofing tiles, solar panels, you know that they're going to become more efficient as technology advances. So what you got on your roof in 2022 will more than likely be outdated from a technological standpoint 2023 and beyond.
In the effort to try to save the climate, are we destroying the environment? Well, the interesting thing is that over the last several hundred years, human beings have actually been trying to move away from what you would consider matter-dense fuels towards energy-dense ones. And that means really from wood and dung towards coal, oil, natural gas, uranium. This is a phenomenon that's been going on for a long time. Poor countries around the world are in the process still of moving away from wood and dung as their primary energies. And for the most part, this is a positive thing. As you stop using wood as your major source of fuel, it allows the forests to grow back and the wildlife to return. As you stop burning wood in your home, you no longer need to breathe that toxic smoke. And as you go from coal to natural gas and uranium as your main sources of energy, it holds out the possibility of basically eliminating air pollution altogether.
Public sentiment is definitely starting to change. Okay, I think that individuals are the nuclear lobby, for one thing. They're doing a better job of, putting information out there and educating the public. But also, we've got big players like Bill Gates, who, like him or not, the reality of it is he has started building a nuclear power plant in coal country. So he's doing that. He's obviously a believer in the technology. And look, again, I don't really care for the guy. A lot of the other things he does, he seems like a Bond villain, quite frankly, to me. But he's putting his money behind this project, which I believe, bodes well for the industry. Also, talked about in a previous video the fact that China is also building dozens of nuclear reactors. They're slated to build dozens of nuclear reactors over the next decade or so. Because, again, they've got to power their society. And they're looking at the realities that solar and wind just are not getting it done to the extent that we need it done.
We saw last year in South Korea a citizens' jury deliberated for several months weighing these different issues. They had to decide whether they were going to phase out nuclear or keep it and expand it. They started out 40% in favor of expanding nuclear, but after several months and considering these issues, they ended up voting 60% to expand nuclear. A similar phenomenon just happened last week in Arizona. The voters had a ballot initiative to vote on whether or not to continue with nuclear or to phase it out and try to replace it with natural gas and solar. They ended up rejecting it 70-30. And even here in Europe, we saw the Netherlands is one of the first countries in recent memory to actually announce, as they did last week, that they're going to start to increase their reliance on nuclear power in recognition that there's just no way they could generate significant amounts of energy enough from solar and wind to meet their climate targets.
I think this gentleman has laid out the case pretty well, that renewable sources, the ones that we've heard about so often over the last few years, the ones that a lot of political heft has been, put behind. Little Greta is out there, how dare you, and all that jazz. These things aren't really fit for the long run once you start committing real critical thought to the issue of energy over the next decades and into the middle of the 21st century. So
I think it's natural that those of us that became very concerned about climate change, such a big environmental issue, would gravitate towards really romantic solutions like harmonizing human civilization with the natural world using renewable energies. But I think it's also understandable that as the facts have come in, that many of us have started to question our prior beliefs and change our minds. For me, the question now is, now that we know that renewables can't save the planet, are we going to keep letting them destroy it?
Looks like we're going back to an old technology. You know, electric cars, that's an old technology. They were competing for space with internal combustion engine cars for a hot minute, way back in the early 1900s, late 1800s. They're back again because the technology has been perfected. Okay, the grid is able to handle it. On and on and on. So we're in a similar situation when we talk about nuclear. Yes, it is true. We have had the Chernobyls, the 3 Mile Islands, the Fukushimas. Although Fukushima had a lot to do with that tidal wave, but still, it happened. Okay. But in all of these cases, their technology has advanced, and a lot of intellectual investment and intellectual capital has been built up around the technology. So somebody's probably out there asking, well, would you have one in your backyard? Yeah, I would actually. Now, I don't live close to the Calvert Cliff nuclear power plant, but I do know that's where we get some of our energy from. Um, I look forward to a day, I might not be here to see it, but I look forward to a day where um, maybe you've got nuclear powered substations. I don't know if you would need it. I don't know enough about electricity, but yeah, I'm totally comfortable with the technology. All right. So that's what I'm betting on. I'm betting on nuclear. That's my unsexy, unromanticized, you know, old school technology that I'm betting on with regard to the green energy revolution. And for those of you, well, it ain't green. Damn if it ain't. What's more green than the natural processes that are powering the sun itself? This is a naturally occurring uranium. It's a naturally occurring substance that can provide just tons and tons of very clean energy. Okay? So, you heard it from Schellenberger. You heard my opinion. I'm looking at uranium. Lots of it. FBI, again, not to bring into my home, but to invest in, like through an exchange traded fund, for example. And I'll talk about some of those, the ones I'm looking at, in a later video. Talk to you guys later.